Hello, my dark-sided minions. Today I will be going over the third entry into my Villain Competency Tier List series, where I go over various villains from throughout fictional mediums and estimate them on a tier list, depending on how close they were to achieving their goals, aka their competency. And today we are going to be going over Ord Casto, better known as the Prophet of Truth, the Hierarch of the Covenant, and eventually the sole Hierarch of the Covenant, the man who almost brought the universe to its knees via activation of the Halo arrays, and generally just a deranged, fanatical megalomaniac, which is one of my favorite types of villains, so this should be fun. So, the Prophet of Truth is best described as a manipulator. Similar to Emperor Bellos and Palpatine, he runs an empire, but unlike both of them, who genuinely believe in their own belief systems, the Prophet of Truth knows that his religion is a lie. Because the Prophet of Truth, alongside his two comrades in the Halo series, the Prophet of Regret and the Prophet of Mercy, figured out that the Covenant belief system, which their entire empire was founded on, the fact that they were the reclaimers of Forerunner technology and the heirs to the Forerunner empire that once graced the galaxy, was completely wrong. And in fact, it was humans that were the reclaimers of Forerunner technology, and it was humans who were the heirs to the Forerunner legacy, and the Covenant species just happened to be saved for whatever reason. So, to really understand Ord Casteau and his complex motivations and what brought him to the position he is today, and ultimately his competency, we need to have a quick look at his backstory. So, Ord Casteau, he began his political career as a junior staffer in the Ministry of Concert, which is essentially an administrative branch of the Covenant that handles internal logistics and species relations, etc., etc. They're kind of like a government organization, right? Like they hire people based on their aptitude for handling disputes and filing forms, basically pencil pushers. But the Prophet of Truth, well, the future Prophet of Truth, quickly unearthed a conspiracy, mainly by several Kig-Yar shipmasters, Kig-Yar admirals, basically. If you don't know what the Kig-Yar are, basically the jackals from Halo. They're these raptor-like creatures that serve as the Covenant's shock troopers and snipers, and they wanted to poison infusions, recreational narcotics used by the Ungoi, aka the Grunts. The Kig-Yar and the Ungoi are natural species rivals, and the Kig-Yar were pissed off at the Ungoi because the Ungoi were having a population boom at the time, thereby pushing out Kig-Yar breeding nests. Ord Casteau caught on to this conspiracy pretty quickly, and he tried to unearth it to his superiors to get it shut down, obviously. But the most that his superior did, the Minister of Concert, was find the Kig-Yar shipmasters. He didn't really care about the situation. He thought it was beneath him because generally any concerns involving the lesser species, quote unquote, of the Covenant were beneath individuals like the San Shayum and the Sankili and whatnot, because they were the political elite of the Covenant. Of course, the Prophet of Ord Casteau, future Prophet of Truth, he didn't like this very much, so he filed a formal complaint, but he was just rebuffed by his superiors, and ultimately the poisoning of these infusions resulted in the Ungoi Rebellion, which was a pretty brutal civil war for the Covenant. So afterwards, Gord Casteau was recognized for his ability to try and stem this conflict before it really occurred. Of course, he failed, but that was no fault of his own. And so, therefore, he was given an elevated position within the ministry with which he used the authority of to try and delegate the handing of Forerunner technology through the various Covenant species to equally, because the Covenant were very focused on acquiring Forerunner technology, believing it to be leftovers from their gods, and therefore they were holy relics, and each species wanted them a lot. In truth, recognizing this, tried to evenly distribute them to each species. So this already displays a good level of competency. He was a very politically apt individual. He could delegate well. He could negotiate well. As we can see, he did not stand idly by when he saw what was perceived as injustice. But as evidenced by events that he orchestrated later in his life, I can't help but wonder if he tried to stop this conspiracy off the motivation that it would harm the Covenant rather than any real concern for the Ungoi. That certainly does seem to be the case, especially with how obsessed he becomes with trying to uphold the Covenant at the later part of his life, and especially at the very end of his life when he declares that he will reign as a god over a Covenant empire supreme over the universe. So Knowing that he had this kind of megalomaniacal madness hidden inside him all this time, it kind of leads me to believe that even his acts of good, quote unquote, again, that he committed throughout his life were in service to this deranged dream he had, this ideal of the Covenant that he had in his mind. Anyways, if you're familiar with Halo lore, you basically know the rest of the story. If you're not, the Prophet of Truth, alongside his two co-conspirators, figure out that the Covenant religion is a lie after, coming across an AI, basically a robot created by the foreigners to record all of their deeds and kind of look after their structures after they were long gone, tells them that the humans on Harvest, the planet where the human covenant war, the central conflict in Halo lore starts, all the relics there and the reclaimers there, the reclaimers, aka the humans, are the true heirs to those relics, and the covenant are merely encroaching on them. So, suffice to say, Truth declares a campaign of genocide against the humans, and that's where we get into the true meat of this video. So, what I think about the Prophet of Truth from the get-go, and by the way, Ford Casto and his comrades, they all changed their names to Truth, Mercy, and Regret for the various qualities these three would need to uphold to hide the truth from the Covenant. Of course, Truth himself, given that he was hiding the truth, was ironically named the Prophet of Truth. It was like an eternal reminder of their duty, some kind of self-flagellating things. Um, but from what we can understand about Halo, what we can glean from Halo lore, mainly from the games, which I'm using as my basis, and a bit of the novels, but primarily the games, the Prophet of Truth was a very dangerous and very in control individual. He was very calm, and despite the fact that he was very physically infirm, he was actually fun fact, he was actually put on something called the Roll of Celibates, which was a list of Sanshayum, which was his species, that were not allowed to breed because of how weak their genes were. I mean, he needed a hover chair to move around all the time at any given point. So he definitely was a very weak genetic stock. Not that he cared, of course. I mean, I'm sure this never occurred to him once, but, he was a very weak individual physically, so all his power came from the mental power he held over other people, the authority he held as a religious figure, as a herald of the foreigners, basically a bearer of their word. And he was also dignified as a politician because he was able to balance the other two prophets. Because Regret, the younger prophet, he was very impulsive, headstrong. He always wanted to get into a fight. He was very aligned with the Sangheili, which was a problem that Truth would have to tackle later. He always wanted to be spearheading the Covenant invasions into human space, acquiring forerunner technologies, and just wreaking havoc for the supposed enemies of the Covenant. The Prophet of Mercy was passive. He was a traditionalist type of guy. He was an older gentleman, and he was very reserved and always just relying on doctrines and dogmas to handle situations. Even though it's really interesting that Mercy knew that this whole thing was all bullshit and lies, but he still heavily relied on religious iconography and religious dogma for various issues throughout Covenant history during his time as hierarch. So you got to wonder about the cognitive dissonance there. But, story for another day. Truth kind of delegated these two very contrasting personalities, all while commanding and leading an active genocide against one of the Milky Way's ascendant species, that being humanity. The Covenant forces were actually on a roll throughout the entirety of the war against humanity up until the very end when they started fucking up, which we're about to get to. But, they were glassing human worlds. Their forces were massacring humans on the ground. If not for Spartans, then I believe that the UNSC would have basically collapsed because of a lack of morale. But yeah, so Truth identified the threat of humanity and wanted to eliminate them. But, as time went on and as Truth's, burden of hiding the truth continued, I'm sure that he slowly more and more recognized that this was unsustainable. He couldn't really do this forever. Sooner or later, someone within the Covenant would discover the truth, and ironically, everything that he built to hide the truth would collapse. I'm saying truth a lot this video. So he needed a plan to kind of eliminate his problems within the Covenant, because while humanity were an external threat that he could propagandize as a great demonic enemy, and I mean, the actions of people like Master Chief, John 117, for example, definitely helped with that because he was massacring Covenant forces like a wheat through hay, or a scythe through wheat, I should say. sweet through hate. He was able to demonize humanity quite literally because, Master Chief was called a demon. So the truth was definitely on the top of his game, but now he needed to remove the enemies within. So near the end of the Human Covenant War, after the events of Halo Combat Evolved, when, the UNSC destroyed Installation 04, the first ever Halo ring encountered, a major step forward for both sides in the war, because for the Covenant, at least for most of the Covenant, it was like finding the religious zenith of their whole belief system. It was the device with which the Forerunners would cleanse the world and this multi-alien hegemony of like Ungoy and Kigyar and, Megolo, however you say it, Hunters, Sanghili, Sanshayum, and Jirohanai, and whatever, they were all super stoked for this. And then it got destroyed. And this was actually the perfect justification. Truth couldn't be happier because he feared the Sangheli immensely. Truth felt that if the Sangheli got too close to the actuality of things, they would start rebelling because they were a very intelligent species. They understood things more keenly than, say, the Jirohanai, a race of basically ape men who loved war and violence, and they were very gullible and always, quick to destroy rather than to create. And so someone like Truth could use them to his advantage. So Truth, in his mind, had a little scheme going. And this is kind of where I begin debating his competency a bit, because I'm gonna be honest, guys. The elimination of the elites, while it might have been necessary, I mean, it was just handled very poorly. I don't know how else you would handle it. To be honest, it was kind of an unwinnable situation from the get-go, because if they discovered the truth, then they would have probably rebelled against the Covenant and tore it down from within anyway, and he had no choice. But the way he went about it was so obviously trying to just hamstring in like their elimination from the get-go. Like, he blamed them for the elimination of the Prophet of Regret, despite the fact that it was his decision not to send them reinforcements and recall the troops. It was his to be fair, it wasn't in his control that the installation of war was destroyed. It was kind of Thelvadam's fault. But, he made Thelvadam an arbiter, which later on would become a central figure of his species. He would become a rallying cry for what would eventually become the Covenant Separatists, which was made up of Sangheli and their followers, who were just like, all right, well, fuck this noise. We hate you, because Truth turned against them and he ordered the genocide against them. But another thing I would like to detract against Truth in terms of his competency would be the callous way he kind of disposes of Mercy, too. Because I felt like, as much as he delegated and controlled the other two prophets, they also kind of provided a subliminal, subconscious check on him, because Regret was always like forthcoming and he was forthright. He wanted to be in the fight, and he was also a very strong supporter of the Sangheli. So I'm sure if Truth brought this up with his co-conspirators, they would probably find a way to talk him out of it. Regret especially, and so that's why he didn't want any condescending, well, I should say contradictory ideas. So he kind of just let the demon kill Regret, and he also let Mercy die. And Mercy was very old and wise. He was kind of a counselor. He was kind of like the very, poignant with his words. He was very traditionalist, and of course, Truth couldn't have that either. Because, as we find out, Truth's plan ultimately is to go onto Installation 00 through this whole convoluted plan of going onto Earth with his warship and everything, and activate the Ark, which would remote activate every single Halo array in the galaxy and wipe out all life virtually everywhere except on the Ark, and a few shield worlds, which contained some Sanshayum, right? Because when the flood invaded High Charity and when all this chaos went down at High Charity, in secret, a flotilla of Sanshayum escaped. And here's what I think Truth's plan was. I mean, this was also gathered by watching a bunch of YouTube videos beforehand to kind of discern Truth's motivations better for this video. So I'm kind of just going off what they're saying, but adding my own bit of a twist and take on it, which is basically that Truth planned to kind of build his own Sanshayum hegemonic empire after the galaxy was wiped out. That's kind of why in Halo 3 he was going all megalomaniacal, all Hitler-esque about like his talks of cleansing and purifying the entire galaxy and how he would be heralded as a god of this new order, because in a way he kind of would be, right? Because despite all the really weird moves he made that kind of just weakened himself, subconsciously or consciously, during the climax of Halo 2. It was all in service of an ultimate overarching goal, which was to rule over a new galaxy where he would be reigning as a god. And honestly, at that point, he might as well have just forgotten about the Forerunners. He might have just like said, because the narrative would be his to control at that point, because it would be a mostly empty galaxy with just San Shayum and whatever Covenant loyalists were left on the Ark to populate it. So he would be seen as their prophet, and beyond their prophet, their god, who would walk the path of ascension, who would lead them through the great journey, as the Covenant religion called it. So, to achieve this goal, he needed to sequester himself at the Ark with any remaining Covenant loyalist forces left and try to activate the Halo array. And he also needed to send the San Shayun flotillas across the galaxy and kind of sequester them on certain planets. And from there, they would just lie in wait until Halo's fire wiped out everything: Flood, Human, Sangheili, etc. And from there, Truth would kind of emerge as the sole god of the universe. But this plan was very far fetched, and it also had a lot of holes that one could poke in between. I mean, like for example, what if after he activated the rings and the brutes that were his bodyguards felt that the promise hadn't been achieved? I mean, they would have just ripped him apart easily, right? And the fact of the matter was, he made an enemy of both the Flood, the UNS, of not both. He made an enemy of the Flood, the UNSC, and the Sangheili and all their followers. So he kind of set everyone against him. In that mission in Halo 3 when you storm the Ark, I mean, it's you, Master Chief, the Arbiter, and just this horde of Flood overrunning like Truth's honor guard, like the last of his elite soldiers that are just getting completely destroyed by this onslaught, this coalition built just to stop him. So, while I do think it's commendable Truth attained such levels of power, he backstabbed his way to the top and he navigated this complex political system of the Covenant. He navigated through all these different races and tried to please all of them. He was running the San Shayum, and he also had to manage the grunts, the jackals, the hunters, the Yanmei, these like weird bug things you encounter in the Halo games, and like countless other species. Like, I mean, because the Covenant was made up of like over a dozen species, I think, and more. I don't remember all of them, just the really famous ones. But having to govern all of that, having to hide, the truth, the damning truth about the fact that your whole religion was based on a lie, and still operate a very successful war effort that nearly succeeded until, of course, a Covenant civil war ironically brought about the downfall of his war effort, because the humans and the Sangheili were able to coordinate together, and also the Jiralhanae were just complete idiots. I mean, aside from a few like Atriox, who I actually might cover in a future video on this list, and aside from Atriox and like a few choice others, most of them are just brain dead idiots with not a tactical bone in their bodies. So I mean, they're terrible logistics people, they're terrible managers, terrible governors, terrible politicians. So I mean, Truth really did plan to like fully rely on them purely as a military force, while he and the other Sanshayum that would remain after Halo cleansed the world, or cleansed the galaxy, sorry, would be like the political elite. Like they would be the management and the administrative and the nobility class with with the brutes as their kind of slaves. And that all, I mean, that whole plan just, I mean, it's a very admirable plan. Don't get me wrong. I do respect what Truth sought to achieve. I do respect like the overarching goals of his plan. I do respect the scope of his plan, but ultimately, I just felt like it falls short of being on a Palpatine or Bellows level of nearly successful. Because again, when you look at the other two villains that I've covered so far on this tier list, Palpatine did actually win for a number of years, and Bellows managed to manipulate his way to almost winning once again after failing the first time. Whereas Truth, after he started failing once, I mean, it was just kind of a downward spiral where after Halo 2, he just fell into this megalomaniacal insanity, believing in these delusions of grandeur that he would rule alone as a god over the universe, which, to be fair, if he succeeded, he might have been. But it's kind of like a mixed bag because we don't really know what would have happened. I don't think he knew what would have happened, but there was no way back. He had kind of dug his own grave by then. But again, it was a very unwinnable situation, and factoring in the fact that the Covenant is literally based off a lie, and that's not something he could have possibly controlled or knew or understood of when he attained power and the contemporary era of the Covenant. I will give him a solid elite echelons of darkness listing. He's right below Palpatine and Bellos, and he's currently at the top. I mean, if more villains come up that are more competent than him, I mean, we'll see. We'll see where he lands. But he's going to stay in this category forever because I do respect what he was trying to achieve, what he did manage to achieve. And of course, I do like his design. I mean, it's very regal. He's got these like red robes going on, these like kingly robes, and this crown, this like shimmering, glittering golden crown signifying his authority and his greatness over the rest of the Covenant. I mean, it's just a really great thing from an aesthetic standpoint. So, you know, and that's half the battle for villains, the drip, right? So anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And hey, if you are going to comment, maybe comment what villains you'd like to see next on this tier list. And as always, thank you so much for watching my dark-sided minions of doom. Have a good one.